Fall is here, so let's paint a baby deer. I'm Viv. Welcome to Art with Viv. Come on and let's go paint. Now I've already sketched out my deer, and what I did was I put a circle around him, and I'm going to add the foliage for the little wreath later on. I did not sketch that out. I just went ahead and kind of free-handed it a little bit. First thing I'm doing is I'm painting the deer's eyes, and I'm doing that with a dark color that I've mixed from blue and brown. And I'm being really careful to leave a little bit of the white of the paper to show, a little bit of that paper to be dry, so that he'll have a highlight. I want his eyes to have a little sparkle in them, so I left some of that paper dry, little tiny dots. Try to get a little closer so you can see better. Now I have taken some raw sienna and thinned it till it's about the consistency of skim milk, and I'm just going to paint a glaze over the little deer, all over his whole body. With this is going to be our base layer, and we are going to build on that. And that little noise you hear is my dove in the background. That is Dorian Gray. He is cheering us on, and he was named after the book character Dorian Gray because he is a beautiful, beautiful diamond dove. And I thought that that would be an appropriate name, and he is also a boy. So that is Dorian. He is our biggest cheerleader around here. You will often hear him in my in my videos, cooing in the background, cheering us on. So you want to get that layer down, and I've pretty much, and I'm just sort of blending it out. I'm using a number 4 mimic squirrel hair round, and that is made by Creative Mark, but it's a mimic. I'm going to go over his ears. You notice I'm leaving where the little white tufts, I'm leaving that without any of the paint on it, because we're going to come back later with some white gouache and fill that in. But I don't want that yellow to be under it, because it will show through the white a little bit. So now I've got that nice base. While it's still a little bit wet, I'm coming in there with some burnt sienna, and I'm just going to start doing the shapes of the shadows. That is the most important thing, is to try to get the shapes of the shadows, the value, which means the lightness or darkness, and you kind of get them in the right spot. And if you get those shapes correct, the value correct, and get them in the right spot, then you will have a 3-dimensional looking painting that'll look more realistic. So you keep those things in mind when you're looking at your reference photo. This one doesn't have a reference photo. It's sort of out of my imagination. So my deer is a little lumpy, but that's okay. We're not trying to do the Mona Lisa. We're just trying to warm up a little bit, do a little fall painting, and get our painting hats on here. So I'm just trying to figure out, when I don't have a reference photo, what I try to do is I try to figure out where would the shadows be that would make it look more 3-dimensional, and that's where I put them. Now on his nose here, I'm taking a little bit of sepia, really thinned out, and while it's still wet, and I'm putting it right above his nose, right on his snout. And while it's still wet, I'm really putting a lot of paint right in the middle to darken that up. And I'm continuing with the burnt sienna so that I can get some shadows in there. This little deer, his mama has left him so she could go eat. He's all curled up and hiding. He's been born late in the season, so he has to hide. And it's a little bit chilly, so he's staying all bundled up, wrapped around himself. I'm just going to continue to add some shadows where I think that they would look the best. And I have looked at some baby deers for reference. I just don't have a specific reference photo for this baby deer. So, I mean, I'm not getting it completely out of thin air. I looked at some baby deer, some little fawns. I before I painted this, so I've got kind of an idea of where the shadows would be. And I encourage you to, you don't have to get the same exact baby deer, in this exact position. You can look at other baby deers and decide how their structure, their bone structure creates shadows and all those things. Now I'm just going to keep on adding shadows, working on him. I'm doing a little bit darker up here on his ears. His ears are just a little tiny bit darker than the rest of his body. They're more like his snout, his little nose there. They got that sepia tone to them. So I'm going to let you watch while I paint, enjoy some music, and I will be back shortly. So you'll want to finish up some of those shadows. And now I'm taking a mixture of that indigo blue, a little bit of sepia, and I'm darkening up his eyes in some areas because when it dried a little bit lighter. I want it to be a little bit darker. And for his little nose, the tip of his nose is really dark. So I'm coming in there with that really dark mixture, and I'm going ahead and putting the shape of his nose in and going and just sort of darkening up some areas of his eyes. Notice I left a little bit of white on each side of that dark shape for his nostril. And now I'm just going to go ahead and add a little bit more shadows. And just paint his little front leg is all tucked in behind his head and behind his back leg in here. So I paint it a little bit darker because it's in more shadow. You see his little hoof is still light there peeking out. Just adding some shadows here and there just to give it a little texture and just to give it a little bit more of a realistic look. We're not going for total realism, but we want it to look a little bit real. We want the one who look at it that know that is a deer and not a mouse. It's not a badger, it's a baby deer, so we want to know. Then once you get all that done, you're going to want to let that dry. Let it dry really well, and then we're going to start putting in some textures and deepening up those shadows. So I have switched to a number 2. It is a Low Cornell Ultra Round, pointed round. I cannot find them right now. I don't know if they've discontinued this series, but I really love it because it has the really sharp tip. It has a really fine tip, and it makes beautiful animal fur. So that's what I'm doing. I'm just doing some texture marks in the shadows. I'm doing it with a darker brown so that we'll have a light brown, a medium brown, a darker brown, and before long we'll have even darker brown. But we're building up those layers, building up the texture, and starting to really make this little baby deer come to life. He is looking pretty good. I'm proud of him so far. No bad mistakes that I can see. I mean, nothing really yucky. But sometimes they do go through that adolescent stage, you know, where your painting is ugly and you want to give up. Push through that, push through it. It's not going to stay ugly. It will get better. So you just got to get through that ugly stage. Now, if you are enjoying this, please, please, please consider subscribing to my channel. That would help me so much, and I can continue making these videos for you. And if you enjoy them, I want to continue making them. So please consider subscribing. Now I'm just going to keep on just adding texture into some of the darker shadows. Notice I'm putting it mostly in the darker shadows. Now when I go to the lighter areas, I switch the color of paint to a lighter brown. In the dark shadows, I use the darker, like an umber color. In those lighter areas, I use more of a sienna or a burnt sienna, depending on which lighter areas I'm using, so that it still coincides and it looks more unified. So that's what I'm doing. I'm going to let you watch just a little bit and enjoy just the process. Listen to a little music, and I will be back shortly. So I'm just adding another layer of color right on top, even over the lighter areas. It's a really, really milky, not milky, I'd say it's a watery, like skim milk, thin wash, and I'm just putting it over the whole baby deer and just trying to sort of, what that does is it sort of blends in, softens up those texture marks, those hair marks we made, so that they're not sitting right on top of the paper. So it just sort of softens those and blends those down. I'm also adding a little bit more color to some of the shadows to darken those up. Adding a little bit more to the snout, a little bit of more of that dark brown, just to darken that up. And if you'll notice, right on the top of the nose where it was white, I put a really pale gray color there. You can use Payne's gray that's been really watered down if you would like. I just used the indigo and with a little bit of the brown in it and watered that down, so that you don't have to use every color I suggest. Use what you have on your palette. As long as you have a light, a dark, and a medium, you should be able, a brown, you should be able to get this deer painted, and a blue. That's really the basic colors as far as the deer goes. Now you can use any colors on the foliage that we're going to do on the wreath. That's totally up to you. But I'm darkening in these shadows. I'm leaving the area around his eye light because he has a little white, lighter kind of beigey area around his eyes. Most baby deer do. So we're going to leave that lighter. And I'm just darkening up shadows just wherever I see that it needs it and softening up those texture lines. Now you are going to let that dry, and once it gets dry, we're going to start just adding in some white gouache. You can use white gouache, you can use Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White, you can use white acrylic paint if you have it, a white paint pen. I've got gouache on my palette today, so we're using white gouache, and I am back to that number 4 creative mark, mimic faux squirrel hair. I tried to say squirrel and hair and got square. Faux squirrel hair brush, and just get those light areas where the little baby deer has some white on him, and make sure that your gouache is kind of thick. You want it to be opaque. I'm lightening up that little area I told you about around his eyes with that white gouache. And in the inside of his ears, that fur is white, so I put that in there. Around his little tail and his little bottom, we put some white. Now I'm just adding some white details to his nose, some little highlights. And right around his eyes. He's looking pretty good. And I'm just coming in here and just making sure that I shape this little face right. His face was getting out of control there. It wasn't shaped right, so I just reshaped it. Now I'm adding an even darker shadow to that leg that's tucked in underneath his head and his back leg, that all curled under there. Now I am rinsing off my brush and picking up some more gouache. And now I'm just going to do those little white spots that baby deer are known for. That's how we know they're babies. And they're little. But the white spots are to help them be camouflaged. Because like I said earlier, the mama's out eating and she's got him tucked away hidden. So if you find a baby deer all tucked away, he has not been abandoned by his mother. They hide them in the bushes and they let them, they let them hide. They don't have a smell, much of a smell, so predators can't sniff them out. And those dappled marks, those little white dots, they are supposed to look like sunlight dappled on the ground so that predators have a hard time seeing them even if they do come up on them. So if you see a baby deer, just leave it alone if it's all curled up. Now if it's an obvious distress, that's different. But baby deer, all curled up, all hiding, they are perfectly fine. Mama's just left them. So now you're getting a little nature lesson along with your art lesson. But I am a jack of all trades. So here we go. He is really looking like a little baby deer now. I mean, he's really looking like a deer. We've got him fleshed out pretty well. And I am liking what I'm seeing. Now I have drawn all of those. I just kind of free-handed the foliage. I have some mushrooms, some oak leaves, some fern leaves, some berries. You can freehand yours however you would like it. You don't even have to have a wreath. That's optional, but I wanted to put him in a little wreath, so I'm painting the mushrooms. I'm using a sort of a permanent rose color. I'm painting some of the leaves sort of a golden with a little bit of new gamboge mixed with some transparent orange. And I'm really just using whatever I have on my palette. That's some olive green. If you were a member of the SAS squad, that's what I call them, the Sweet Art Squad, then you will get the line drawing as well as a list of colors that I used in painting this along with this video inside that membership. It's only $5 a month. You can't really beat that. I mean, you're getting the line drawing, you're getting a supply list, you're getting this video so you can see how to paint it. I mean, for $5 a month, that's less than $1 Starbucks a week. You get by $1 Starbucks and then you can just give up $1 Starbucks and there you go. You've got your membership due paid for the month. So anyway, if you're interested in that, I'll link it in the description. But in that, you'll get this video, but you'll also get the line drawing, the supply list. You can also join my private Facebook, so if you need to ask questions about these paintings, if you need to know something, you are welcome to do so inside of there. There's a lot of great women in there. I love my little private Facebook group. Those are some of the best women. Anyway, back to the painting. I just thought I'd mention it in case you're interested. Back to the painting. Now I'm just going to continue to use all of my different greens and roses and oranges, and I've added a little bit of cobalt teal to one of my greens, like a sap green, just to make it sort of a blue green for my little fern shape I've got here. And I'm just going to paint that in. So I'm going to let you watch me paint the foliage. You can paint your foliage however you would like. You can draw it however you would like. Use whatever colors you have on the palette. You don't have to do it like mine. Mine is just sort of a out of my head sort of deal. So I'm going to let you watch, enjoy some music, and I will be back shortly.
Noticed I've let on some of like the oak leaves. I've mixed oranges and a little bit of permanent magenta. I've painted the berries and I've left little white dots as highlights. I'm painting the mushroom stem sort of a really pale brown. And now I've decided I'm going to come back in with some watercolor pencils and just add a little bit more foliage. This is an optional, really an optional step, but I thought I would mention it that I did that in case you wanted to try it. Actually, when you're working with something this small, these tiny little foliage leaves and things and mushrooms, it's a little bit hard with a paintbrush unless you got a really steady hand. So I thought I would clean it up and show you that I'm just using watercolor pencils, and then I'm just using my paintbrush to sort of activate the pigment that I put on the paper from the pencils. I'm adding in some like really bright purple berries. Now I just have an inexpensive set. These are just General, that's the name brand, General's watercolor pencils. I think it's a set of 12. But if you have some really nice ones, then go ahead and use those. They probably have a lot better variety of colors, and you can just fill that in. Notice it gives it a little bit of extra brightness. For some reason in those colored pencils, the extra color and the extra foliage just make it pop. So I just thought I'd mention that. You can also do that. If you don't want to paint them with watercolor, you can do them completely in watercolor pencil if you don't want to use your paintbrush to paint such tiny things. If you have trouble with your hands, like sometimes I get arthritis and it hurts for me to paint, but you know, if you use the pencils, it can be a little better, especially if you get those pencil attachments that make the pencil fatter and easier to grab onto. You just slip them over your pencil. And so I'm going to let you watch this for just a little bit. In just quickly a few minutes, I will be right back to go with the next step. Enjoy some music. Okay, now we've got that all done and dried, so I'm just going to go with my really dark blue here. You can use anthraquinine, you can use indigo, you can use whatever blue you would like, or you could just leave it like it is and not put this blue background in. Completely, totally up to you. I'm just doing it directly onto dry paper, and I'm trying to be really careful going around those little foliages, all of those little mushrooms and berries and plants. So that is our next step. We're going to get that nice and painted in. And you cannot see it, but the circle that I drew, I can still see it through some of the foliage. So I'm actually taking that blue to the edge of the circle, not outside of it, not on the other side of the foliage, but just inside of the foliage, just inside that circle. I'm not going outside of the circle. So that means I'm bringing it even, you know, in between those plants, all the way to the edge of that circle. So that means you have to paint around some of the little leaves. And it is a little bit tedious and it will take you a while, but it's also kind of meditative. So go ahead, paint your background blue or not, totally optional. And when you finish, it should look like this or similar, unless you didn't paint it, of course. Then I'm just going to add right here to the bottom a few dark marks just to indicate that this is ground or this is some leaves that he's sleeping on. I don't want him floating around in that circle of foliage, in that little wreath. I want to ground him, so I put some little shadow work in there. And I think he's looking pretty good. That blues with the browns and oranges, whew, just makes him pop. So now I'm going to take that white gouache and I'm going to do some dots on the mushrooms so that they look like those, what are they called, flygaric mushrooms. We're going to put some dots on the mushrooms, some highlights on the berries, and just a few little highlights underneath the gills of the mushrooms and on the stems, just to give them a little bit of pattern and just to give some interest to the whole outlook, the whole composition. And once I get that done and put a few highlights here and there, I think he's going to be pretty much finished. So I thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, please consider subscribing. Hit the bell for the notifications so that you will get notifications of whenever I post. And please consider subscribing. I'll see you next week.